Today I'm talking about AI governance because it's a topic that I think not enough people talk about.
Generative AI introduces a whole new category of risks. That story struck fear in the hearts of, I think, every large enterprise.
You are listening to the AI with Maribel Lopez podcast, or AI with ML. If this is your first time listening, thank you for joining. The AI with Maribel Lopez podcast is brought to you by the Data for Betterment Foundation. This podcast shares the stories of the people behind the new world of data and AI. What are they creating? And why does it matter? If you like this episode, please subscribe so you can easily find the podcast again. You can find the video version of this podcast at youtube.com at AI with Maribel Lopez. You can also share your feedback and ideas with me on X, also known as Twitter, and LinkedIn. All links are in the show notes. Extended show notes, episodes, and transcripts can be found at lopezresearch.com/podcast. I hope you'll enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome back to the AI with Maribel Lopez podcast. I'm Maribel Lopez, and today I'm talking about one of my favorite topics, which is AI governance. I've done a lot of podcasts on governance recently, perhaps because it's a topic that I think not enough people talk about and that we need to talk about more. So to do that, I am joined by Susannah Shattuck. She is the head of product for Credo AI. Hi, Susannah. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So perhaps to get started, you can tell us in your own words what Credo AI's mission is and provide us with some color on what you actually do on a day-to-day basis so we get to know you better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm head of product at Credo AI. We build AI governance software for the enterprise. So we build tools that help large organizations ensure that every single AI system that they're buying, building, using is compliant with relevant laws, regulations, standards, and internal company policies, and also effectively risk managed. And so in my day-to-day work, I'm working very closely with our customers to ensure that the product that we're providing them is meeting all of their needs. And I work very closely with our engineering and design teams in order to make sure that the products that we're building is effective and aligned with those market needs. So I really spend my day living and breathing the realities and challenges of AI governance. And I'm very excited to talk to you about this today.
Awesome. So let's just jump in and talk a little bit about the state of what's going to happen in the rest of 2024 and in 2025. I thought perhaps we could start by discussing some of the types of AI risks you see that organizations should be aware of. I know that you recently did a webinar highlighting some of the AI risk categories, and I thought that might be a good place for us to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying that generative AI has really shifted a lot of things in terms of AI risk. When I got started working in the AI governance space about 8 years ago, the big focus was on algorithmic bias and fairness and explainability. And of course, those are two really critical risks still. Ensuring that the AI systems that you are using or implementing are not going to harm people through unwanted harmful bias, ensuring that the people who are using those systems can actually understand how they work sufficiently to make the right decisions based on those systems. That's critical for human augmented processes or AI augmented processes where humans are making decisions based on AI recommendations. But generative AI introduces a whole new category of risks that we haven't seen before. And these are really challenging for organizations right now that want to start taking advantage of this incredible new technology. In many cases, because many of these risks are not completely possible to mitigate. You can't get to 100% mitigation for some of these risks because we literally don't have the technical approaches yet. So one example is the risk of hallucinations. Now, I know some folks don't like to call it hallucinations because that's giving large language models maybe a little bit more credit than they deserve. Hallucinations really are just a large language model inventing information based on its training data that truly is not true. And that risk is really challenging for organizations that are thinking about deploying large language models in some kind of question answering context, which is a very common sort of desirable context for a large language model. You can't trust a large language model on its own to really accurately and truly answer questions without significant guardrails. Another really critical risk is the risk of sensitive data leakage. For a large enterprise, IP leakage is an incredibly top of mind risk. I think we all remember the headlines, shortly after ChatGPT really hit the scene, that Samsung was dealing with an issue where some Samsung employees had entered in some sensitive information that was now part of OpenAI's training data set. That story struck fear in the hearts of, I think, every large enterprise related to employee usage of these tools, and
as it should have.
As it should have, right? And I think justifiably made a lot of organizations look twice at the terms and conditions of some of these tools, particularly the ones that were available online for free. But when we talk about sensitive data leakage, we're also talking about leakage of PII, personally identifiable information. If you're inputting PII into a large language model and you don't have the right data protections in place, that data goes right into the training data set and could be spit out to somebody else in an illegal way, right? That doesn't align with data privacy and protection. And then I'll say the last sort of set of risks that I'll highlight now, there are certainly more that we can talk about, but that are really top of mind are security risks. And there are a bunch of interesting examples of the ways in which AI systems can be attacked by bad actors to actually produce different outputs than the creators or the implementers actually intended. The really classic example, I live in the Bay Area where we have lots of self-driving cars. There's a particular sticker that you used to be able to buy and put on a stop sign that was a really small, innocuous sticker that made self-driving cars actually register that stop sign as a yield sign, which is incredibly dangerous and effectively an attack on that AI system. So in similar ways, large language models can be attacked to produce adversarial prompts or to circumvent their sort of underlying instructions, their system prompt, in a way that can be manipulated by bad actors. So there are certainly cybersecurity risks when you're thinking about deploying large language models into connected systems that might be tied to the very core of your business infrastructure.
One of the things I've been thinking about is doing a separate podcast specifically on AI security risks because it's such a big topic and it's going to continue to be a larger topic as we move forward. And there are many different types, as you mentioned. But we've got so much to talk about in the governance field. I'm going to switch gears back for a second. McKinsey had some research that revealed 63% of organizations view the implementation of generative AI as a top priority. Okay, that makes total sense, right? Yet 91% feel they're ill-prepared to navigate its challenges responsibly. So there's so many things that you could do as you're delivering an AI strategy, and governance is often an afterthought, as we started in the discussion with. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what should be included in a governance strategy, or just give us a little context for how we should think about governance.
Yeah, great question. This is a question that we get all the time from organizations that are, just getting started and they really don't know where to get started. So I'll say there are a couple of key steps we call it the AI governance journey, that an organization needs to go through in order to actually be able to get any sort of visibility into and then control over these risks that we were just talking about. The first is that you really need to know where and how your organization is using AI to, first of all, be able to even understand what the potential risks are. And a lot of organizations that come to us that don't have any kind of AI governance program in place yet don't have that centralized catalog, that centralized register of their different AI use cases in the organization, which is sort of a fundamental obstacle to then being able to manage those risks. So the first step is really to take stock of where your organization is using AI. And there are a couple of key ways to do this. One is, of course, you can go out and ask people, but perhaps a more foolproof way is to actually think about all of the different tools that you're using that track those AI systems already. For example, if you have a data science team that's building AI systems, they certainly have a technical model store as part of their model development tooling. So having your governance team get access to that and be able to pull that into sort of a governance register is a great first step. Thinking also about your TPRM tooling, your third-party risk management tooling. There are questionnaires, right, that you can ask your vendors about whether or not they're using AI that then give you a full list of what all the third-party AI systems in your organization might be. And so I always encourage an organization to, rather than going out and thinking about, asking people in a survey or trying to create new data about where AI is being used, can we just leverage the existing data to create that centralized registry? And then I think the other really important thing for an organization that wants to get started doing governance to do is to actually define for that organization, what does high risk mean to us? What does medium risk mean to us? What does low risk mean to us? And I say that because one of the biggest obstacles, quite honestly, to AI governance is the pushback that this is going to slow us down, that this is going to prevent us from adopting AI. And so I really do believe that a governance program can only be effective if it's not only slowing down high risk use cases that are justifiably needing to be slowed down because they really pose fundamental critical business risks to the organization, but a governance program is really only credible and effective and gets buy-in from others when it also has that release valve for low risk use cases, where you can identify a low risk use case and allow that use case to move quickly through the governance process. That's the only way that a governance team is going to build trust with, the stakeholders in an organization who are primarily focused on AI adoption, which I think that McKinsey stat illustrates is a top enterprise priority right now.
There's always that speed, security, responsibility, governance trade-off that people are navigating. And I really like that idea of, how do we streamline it for the low risk use cases? That makes a lot of sense to me. Now, on that topic, we see many organizations are developing responsible AI strategies. Yep. And there's often a separate team that's doing governance strategies. So in your opinion, how integrated should these strategies be, or what's the best way to think about the similarities and the differences?
Great question. So oftentimes the team that's coming up with responsible AI strategies, that often originates in a technical team. And I find that responsible AI as a term generally means fair, explainable, performant, secure. It's sort of referring to a very specific set of technical AI risks, usually. And that is an absolutely critical piece of governance. And so, that is definitely an effort and a team that needs to be included in and part of your governance program. But governance is a little bit more expansive than just looking at technical AI risk. And I think, particularly with the new compliance requirements that are coming into effect, we're looking at the EU AI Act very closely. That's on the books now and in effect. We're looking at local laws and regulations here in the United States, in Utah and Colorado and New York, California. There's a lot of regulatory requirements that are emerging that are not going to be fully addressed by simply looking at technical AI risks. A lot of these regulations are actually requiring that an organization does impact assessments on potential harm, right? Beyond just looking at model behavior and understanding inputs and outputs and calculating fairness metrics or demonstrating technical explainability. So governance teams need to include technical stakeholders who are doing technical evaluations of technical AI risk. They also need to include legal stakeholders, people from other parts of the organization that are already doing governance around things like data privacy or security, to be a more holistic and oriented towards not just technical risk, but also compliance program.
That makes a lot of sense to me. They are tightly aligned, but not necessarily the same thing. You mentioned the EU. Yeah. And the EU AI Act has been getting much interest, excitement, and fear all at the same time. You actually recently hosted a webinar featuring one of the European Parliament members that actually was working on the EU AI Act. So I was wondering if you could discuss some of what your insights were from that panel, what you learned, what we should be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying that the EU AI Act is anticipated, like GDPR, to be sort of the most impactful and also, in many cases, highest bar AI regulation that we're going to see for a while. Like GDPR and the EU spawned copycat regulations all around the world and became sort of the de facto standard for evaluating compliance of your data privacy program. Similarly, we expect the EU AI Act to be the same. And so we've been tracking it very closely for many years now as it's gone through many iterations. And what our most recent webinar was really focused on was understanding the final version of the EU AI Act that now is officially on the books. It's in effect. The deadlines are now ticking for organizations to get in compliance. What does that look like? And what are the things that organizations should really keep in mind as they start to prepare to comply with this sweeping regulation? And I think there are a couple of really interesting things about the EU AI Act that I believe will set standards for AI regulation around the world. One is that the EU AI Act takes a use case based approach in addition to a technology approach. What that means is that different parts of the EU AI Act are going to apply to different AI systems based not only on the technical scope of those systems, but also the context of where and how they're being used. You're probably familiar, you've probably heard of the high risk, minimal risk, limited risk framework of the EU AI Act, the risk-based framework. That is purely based on context, based on where, how, and why you're using an AI system. And that's an approach that we're seeing copied in other regulations, even here in the US. The OMB guidance that was created based on President Biden's executive order about federal agency use of AI is also taking a use case based approach to governance. So that's a really important trend that is certainly still true in the final text compared to previous versions. I think the other really interesting thing to look at with the EU AI Act are the obligations to general purpose AI providers, otherwise known as foundation models or large language models. The EU AI Act took some criticism for sort of hurriedly adding components to the law that were going to be specific to general purpose AI systems, because the generative AI boom happened well after the EU AI Act had already been drafted and was going through the legislative process. But I actually think that there are some really interesting sort of standards that are established by the EU AI Act related to general purpose AI systems. One of them is related to sort of the size of the model being a core driver of whether it falls under governance requirements of the EU AI Act. We will see if that continues to be a regulatory trend or if there are other factors that are going to push regulators to regulate some general purpose models more than others. But the use case approach doesn't work as well for general purpose models because of their general purpose nature, right? You might be able to govern GPT-4 in the context of consumer use, but you're not going to be able to lock down every possible adversarial behavior that somebody might want to do with that model in the same way that you have more control over a narrow machine learning model by just limiting its development. So anyway, I think the EU AI Act is going to be a really interesting landmark regulation that influences regulation all around the world. And organizations do need to start getting into compliance because, again, it's on the books.
So that contextual approach and the difference between large foundation models and what might be evolving into smaller models, more specific industry models, I think that'll be a really interesting dynamic to look out for as we move on. So perhaps as a last question, I know we talked a little bit about the EU AI Act and some of the things that might happen in governance as a result of that, but are there other things that you expect to change in governance over the next 2 to 3 years? Put on the crystal ball hat for a moment here.
Great question. As I mentioned before, I've been working in this space for 8 years, and the dramatic change that we've seen in, I would say, the last 18 months really accelerated by generative AI, I think is only going to continue. And so, 8 years ago, lawyers were asking me to leave the room when I started to talk about algorithmic bias and fairness, because there was a belief that if you weren't aware of bias in your models, you weren't going to be held liable for them. Now we have those same lawyers in many cases proactively reaching out about some of those generative AI risks that I was just talking about: IP risk, copyright infringement risk. And so I think there's been a really dramatic shift in just the level of awareness and, as a result, desire to actually take action. And I think we're going to see that increase to the point that I wouldn't be surprised in 2 years if every Fortune 2000 company has an AI governance program, because they have to, because it's no longer a nice to have or optional. Regulations and risks push them to have this because it's a business imperative.
Well, I certainly hope that that is something that comes to light. Susannah, thank you for your time. It's been wonderful talking to you, and keep building the great things that you're building so that we can have a safer, better world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Additional content can be found at lopezresearch.com/podcasts. Until next time, wishing you all the best.